So today I'm talking about security descriptors. It's one of my favorite things to talk about, and it's going to go pretty deep into the weeds, okay? It's not this futuristic ideal. I mean, it's today. It's something hands-on keyboard admins of Active Directory can go back to their office on Monday and start implementing these best practices if they wish. So, yeah, security descriptors, one of my favorite things. So something about myself is I really like control, and I don't like to share it. So all of these, you all agree. I mean, you're all in the same boat. We're all security experts. My husband's in the audience, and I know he agrees. So every aspect of a security descriptor addresses some sort of control, right? So from the creator owner stamped with the server or Windows team that built the image your domain controllers are running on, down to the admins able to change the CEO's password. Every aspect of a security descriptor must be intentionally controlled. So that's what we're talking about today. I guess first, a few things about myself. So I'm a technical expert working on securing Active Directory for some big retailer that resides in every small town USA. I enjoy making every application developer's life more painful at 3 in the morning when they swear they haven't changed anything, and Active Directory is just all of a sudden giving them a password mismatch error, because that for sure is an LDAP error, right? Once upon a time, I was a Java developer, but don't hold that against me. My foot in the door of cybersecurity was actually writing C# code for our endpoint team trying to, I saw you're a fan. All right. So trying to find computers that were missing from our antivirus repository. Let's see, I'm the mother of 2 beautiful, crazy boys. And so story time. So the other day, I wanted to make a smoothie. And I'm trying to learn from my mistakes. The blender scares the living hell out of my 1-year-old, right? So I put him in his crib. I said, okay, Logan, it's going to be 1 minute tops. That was the day that he climbed out of his crib for the first time. So that story doesn't have anything to do with security descriptors, but access control, whether for your children or for your security program, you see where I'm going, it should evolve, and it should evolve quickly. So I keep my blender in the garage now. Let's get started with why we're all here. Default permissions leave you vulnerable. So in its default state, as soon as you want to manage anything about your environment, you would have to provide excessive access. So take user objects, for example. Incident response may need the ability at any given time to disable a user's account, right? Do they need the ability to change any random password for a user? No, probably not. Passwords are not optimal. We've been saying that for 10 years. People have said today. There's a talk later today on going passwordless. I think there's 2 talks on going passwordless, actually. So we'll be saying this for another 10 years. Things like smart card required is available, but it does not meet the needs of what we consider to be multi-factor anymore for today's environment. Active Directory is complex. Most people simply do not understand the security descriptor model. And it's important to know how to properly secure Active Directory and how to properly delegate controls for those who are managing aspects of it. The very reason for Active Directory's existence makes it a high-value target. So it's very important. So I want to, I guess, lay the foundation of all the aspects of a security descriptor before I go over some of the best practices. And essentially, I know we find them all over Windows, registry keys, file system, whatever. But when I'm talking about security descriptors today, I'm talking about Active Directory security descriptors. They can all take different formats, and NT security descriptors. So that's likely what is top of mind when people think of security descriptors. But there are many, many attributes in Active Directory that take the security descriptor format. And even within Active Directory itself, sometimes they act a little differently. So what I'm getting at is one of my favorite attributes. So I think we're all familiar with GMSAs, Group Managed Service Accounts, right? So there's an attribute, MSDS, Group MSA membership, right? And so that security descriptor, which is just an attribute on the group itself. So by default, the owner and the the owner and the DACL, they're null. So they're not granting rights to anything. A lot of times that attribute is populated with some sort of security principle on creation, but it doesn't have to be. So I guess my point here is that security descriptors, you really need to manage every individual part of it. A lot of people focus just on, the DACLs and the ACEs that reside in them. But take owner for example. It's overlooked, but it's really crucial. And so by default, the creator owner is set up with write DACL and read write control. And so essentially that allows you the ability to update the DACL, so then you can have whatever permissions you want. So it's important when you are thinking about permissions for your organization that you think of it holistically, the whole security descriptor, and not just individual ACEs. So a lot of times, what I have found other administrators do, they don't supply the security descriptor at the time they are creating an object. And a lot of times that's because, well, it's a limit of the tools you are using. And so when you do not supply a security descriptor at the time it is created, the default security descriptor comes into play. And I guess, so there are tools that do allow you to update the security descriptor at time of creation. So several .NET IP APIs and ADMod, for example. So this security descriptor definition language, most people are used to referring to this as SDDL, right? And SDDL essentially makes the security descriptor readable. There's many tools will automatically decode the security descriptor for you, but ultimately it gets back to that binary data because that is how it's stored in Active Directory and that's how it's used. And what I mean by decoding and the level of decoding, do you want to see your permissions as AO, BA, WP, or do you want to see account operators, built-in admins, write permissions? So yeah, this is what I mean. So just simply a hex representation of the binary structure. Not as readable as one would like. Raw DDL example. So it's a little easier to read, right? So some people would say this is perfectly readable. Others, have a life. Next, so a fully decoded SDDL. So this is, what most people would prefer to be in. And also, yeah, you see SNP. So this isn't a full SD that I'm showing you. You also might have been expecting output that looked like from DSACLs, for example. Well, I think we would still be waiting for it to generate, quite honestly. if we went that route. But this is from a tool called ADFind. And so this great individual, Joe Richards, wrote it. He also was part of Deck and Tech, and yeah, I think a lot of people here know who that is. But anyways, so now to the fun stuff. So SACLs, access control lists. So those are, the lists are composed of entries, access control entries. And I guess several things at play. So DACLs and SACLs, discretionary access control lists, those are for granting or denying permissions. SACLs, system access control lists, are for auditing purposes. So ACEs, there's two types of ACEs. So there would be generic, which is not specific at all. So if you want to think generic read or generic write for the entire object. The other would be object specific. And so you can have that granular control that is for a particular property. So do you want to be able to update the entire object, or do you want to allow an administrator or group to be able to only update SEM accounting? Let's see. So one of the things listed here under access mask, you'll see control access. And simply, how many people here have heard of control access rights? I think, yeah, so more commonly people know them as extended rights, primarily because it's, in the extended rights container. Well, control access is the right that would, be associated with control access rights. So these, they provide special access that isn't a simple read or a simple write of a simple property. There is some internal hard-coded work that is going on in the background. And when you are implementing a control access, you might have to, when you're using that, it might be updating multiple attributes in the background that you're not aware of. So I guess a couple of examples. Let's see, validate write for DNS host names. So that you can't simply put anything in that value, right? It's a control access right, and it's going to do some validation in order for that operation to succeed. Next, change password. So in order to change password, that's a control access. You're not simply writing the property. You have to provide the old password with the new password, that sort of thing. So that's what control access rights would be. So next, I guess, so still along the lines of ACEs, but this is simply some examples you would see. I have examples in here of both DACLs and SACLs. So ultimately, they look the same, they have the same format and everything, but they might work a little differently. So ultimately, so I don't know who's ever done this, it might just be me, but when you're reading a DACL and you're going down the security descriptor, and then you think, oh my God, who gave so-and-so full control? Who did that? Well, you need to look at the ACE type. You need to look at the field because it might just be the SACL. And SACL, if you provide full control, that simply means you're auditing for everything. All right. This is my transition slide. I don't have some special transition speech. Everything that I just said is leading up to what's coming. So that's laying the foundation for the best practices that I can provide. These are some best practices. They work for me. They might not work for every organization. You have to keep it in mind. Scale, right? What works for a large corporation might not work for an organization that has 50 people and 2 IT admins. All right, so least privilege, that's not a new term to anybody. It's been said multiple times this week. The first one is about being purposeful and about the level of granularity you want to set. So you need to have a plan, and you need to be able to adapt that plan. Security is a sliding scale, so it's reward versus work. So that goes back to if you have 50 people into IT admins, what are you gaining by being so granular? It's very likely the same person creating users is updating the groups. Whereas in a large organization, you do need that granularity. It's very likely they might be completely different teams, let alone individuals. So yeah, be cognizant about your organization. The other 4 bullet points, those are really about reducing complexity. You want to be able to look at your OU structure. Picture your OU structure as is today. Does it have many layers? You want to be able to look at the highest level possible and know what's happening. And so take deny all for example. Right, I mean, it's all about exceptions and one-offs. And so if you have something at the top level, you expect it to trickle down. Same thing happens with protected security descriptors. That's about blocking inheritance. It's adding complexity to your environment. Your delegation model should reflect how your OU is structured. And us, as Active Directory administrators, we get to decide how that looks. So be intentional with it. Privilege versus non-privilege, that's a spectrum. Security is a spectrum. You have to know what your organization is, and define what administrators look like, what elevated accounts look like for your organization. Yeah, so assignment. So going back to where the security descriptors, the delegations you should place and at which level and everything, it's again all about being intentional. So the first, domain, local, global, universal. So we all know what group scopes are, and doesn't work with Windows authentication. It's really just looking at member of, for example. Then it doesn't necessarily matter. Do whatever you want. Never assign permissions directly to users. So it's a management nightmare. I've been on outages. I have been on outages recently to where, a team is wanting to switch process IDs. And well, the process IDs are in the same group. So why do the process IDs have different permissions? Well, somebody applied a permission directly to the DACL. So it's the sort of thing that interrupts your sleep, right? A management nightmare, an auditing nightmare. And then along those lines, avoid nesting groups. So a lot of times, applications, they have a hard time chasing nested groups anyways. And again, it's the same thing, a management nightmare. And also, when you're allocating resources and you're trying to modify their delegations, it overly complicates everything. So naming standard, as you can see, I don't want to start a naming standard war. We all have our opinions. I know we've all probably have been in many standard wars. And ultimately, it comes down to how do you want a naming standard that is more obfuscated, or do you want it to be very clear when you look at the model exactly what it is doing? And so I always go towards, the frame of mind of being more concise, being able to quickly scan and knowing exactly what this group is responsible for doing. Strong resource ownership. So you need to know that this is asset management is hard at any level. But it's important, to keep the resource ownership in mind, and then the ownership has to approve access again and again and again. UARs are very frequent. So strip security descriptors of unnecessary ACEs. So that goes back to the point of not complicating your DACL list. You want to provide that granular control. You want to provide the least privilege, and just about being intentional. So if you do not have NT4 domain controllers anymore, and I hope none of you do, but then that's what account operators and printer operators and backup operators, server operators, those are what those groups are for. So empty them. If you don't have NT4, empty them. And finally, so update creator, owner, and primary group. So like I said, so the Windows Server team built my domain controller. That should be where their permissions end. And so it's so important to, regardless of if you're managing permissions for an OU or directly on computer accounts for domain controllers, you need to think about the security descriptor holistically, including the owner. I have primary group on here as well, and ultimately that's just for consistency. I think a lot can be said about having consistency in your security descriptors. Location, yeah, so I've said this before, so you want to be able to quickly scan your OU structure and from the highest level possible, apply those delegations and have them trickle down. Avoid the complexity of denial and protected inheritance. It complicates the security descriptors, and it makes it to where you have to scan every single level to know who has permissions there. So ultimately, it's all about being intentional. It's all about being consistent. Okay, so relocate highly privileged accounts. So ultimately, these are special accounts, right? So you should treat them special. And I know, there's things like admin SD holder, but ultimately, they should be moved out of the general population. And also it makes it so much easier for auditors, when they keep coming to your door and say, hey, you need to get rid of KRBTGD, and because that's happened a time or two. So, right, yeah, see if you can. Yeah, we've been talking a lot about automation tools, and so these are just some of what I recommend. Ultimately, the list isn't comprehensive, right? I don't have the .NET API that I frequently use, system.directoryservices.protocols, which I talked about earlier. Other things on here you might be wondering why they're on this list for managing Active Directory, so such as iCackles. Well, GPOs, for instance, not only are they in Active Directory, but they're also in the file system. If you're updating GPOs using, for instance, PowerShell GPO command list, it's going to do that work for you. It's going to update Active Directory and the file system. But if you're modifying the DACLs directly, you need to be aware that you have to update them in multiple locations, and that might require multiple tools. I mentioned AD-Find, AD-Mod before, so that was a fantastic tool. Regardless of what Windows Defender says, it's not malware. Yeah. Okay, so here, this isn't super easy to read on the screen for everybody, but good thing we're passing out the slides. It's just to show you that automation doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be some 1,000-line Perl script. And by Perl, I mean PowerShell, because who uses Perl anymore? Yeah, the Joe Richards, who wrote AD-Mod, he'd probably throw his water at me if he heard me say that, but he's not here. Yeah, have a framework that's consistent, that allows you to implement, to back out, and to validate. That's really what all of this is about. Yeah, this is important. I've mentioned this before, so that's why it has another slide. But to be intentional with your OU structure, you want it at the highest level. You want to have it trickle down. Delegation needs to be the forefront of your thought process when you're creating your OU structure and nothing else. Flexible, but not too flexible. So you want to be able to, to think about how your company is growing in those demands and think about, is your management style, do you have individual sites, that are managing their own, their own identity management, or do you have a centralized identity management? Generally speaking, you want to have identity management centralized, but then your client model decentralized. Finally, I just wanted to leave you with some very general environment hygiene type of suggestions. So no local system. Don't install third-party applications that run as local system on your domain controllers. Remove domain admin from administrator groups on all member servers. It goes back to least privilege. It always does. And here's the for good empty and avoid NT for operator groups. If you don't have NT for domain controllers, you don't need account operators, you don't need server operators, so on and so forth. Active Directory is meant to be read. I know there was a talk about confidential attributes. If you know how to use them properly, great, but don't overcomplicate your security model, essentially. Utilize GMSAs when you can. Active Directory generates that password for you, and it rotates the password for you automatically. So, and it also prevents, along those lines, being able to interactively log into systems using GMSAs. When you can't use GMSAs, well, and even when you can, but process IDs, I'm used to saying process IDs, but I've come to realize this week that's kind of a Walmart term, but I mean service accounts. So service accounts and GMSAs, they should properly scope. They should be very granular. The exact systems are exact permissions. And yeah, process ID should expire and should rotate just as frequently as users, if not more. So.
All right, you talked about going through security descriptors and cleaning up bases that aren't needed.
Right.
Do you see that as something that you do primarily when you're creating the security descriptor along with the object, say, or is that like a periodic, let's sweep through all the SDs that we can find and clean them up individually?
It's got to be twofold. And yeah, at time of creation, like when we are doing the DC promo process, we have it built in to update creator owner and to remove our server team from having any sort of permissions. But also, if your organization has existed 5, 10, 15 years, there's probably some rework in the layout that has occurred, and especially, it's all about prioritization. So the areas in your OU structure that matter the most, take a look at them and see if there's anything that shouldn't be there.
Well, thanks.
Thank you.
I have a follow-up on that one because I like that topic of cleaning up the SIDs. Everything you don't need is reducing the risk. I love that. So are you guys also changing the default security descriptor in the schema, or would you recommend doing that for those apps that that basically do create objects without sending along a security descriptor? Because I like that idea.
Yeah, absolutely, and I know you do because I heard that in your speech yesterday. So quite frankly, like I'm all about avoiding complexity, and ultimately, complexity, you have to be consistent. So I recommend if you're doing that, then update it in every domain, update it in every forest, be consistent.
Just wondering, in your OU structure, so you were talking about a delegation model and stuff like that, creating your OU structure. If you're creating an OU structure for IT admins, let's just say for tier 0, would you recommend making any modifications to that OU?
Okay, gotcha. Well,
should it be read? Everybody should be able to read it, or that was my question.
No, absolutely not. Essentially, that gets back to my point about moving highly privileged accounts, right?
That's why I was.
And so exactly, thank you. No, it leads into that. So the OU structure, your domain controllers, the administrators of those, the administrators of the groups that provide so and so access, to allow to create other groups. Those need to be away from the general public. They need to, is your identity management the same team as your Active Directory team, or is it separate? So we have to be responsible for giving identity management, those who are controlling the access for other people, only permissions that they need to control. And nothing more. Yeah.
And I had a follow-up on that one, sorry. You brushed the admin SD holder.
I'm sorry, what?
You slightly talked about the admin SD holder for a few seconds.
Right.
I was just wondering if, this is something that we did previously for another customer a long time ago. We modified that just to ensure that, any high privileged account couldn't grant permissions to another high privileged account, meaning you can't grant, DA to anybody else. Is that something that you'd be thinking about recommending? I know that we have Microsoft people here too, and I know that they weren't very fond of us messing around with that specific admin SD holder. So what's your take on that one?
I guess personally, I don't muck with admin SD holder. It works. It has a purpose, and I'm laughing because, his presentation yesterday, we've heard of people having, the security descriptor is changing on, on these highly privileged groups, and I'll just schedule a task to change it back every hour, So don't conflict, what Active Directory is put into place, I guess. Yeah.
So don't mess around with it, is what you're saying.
That would be my recommendation, but perhaps there's other takes I haven't experienced, and something to think about. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.